Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest. Natasha Hausdorff is an expert of international law and a lawyer who volunteers at the organization called UK Lawyers for Israel. And you may have seen her all over the media and on the BBC, I saw her, on Sky, I think, and all different smaller places and also here. So Natasha, it's great to be with you and to talk to you. It's been a long time that I've been following you ever since October 7th when we went through all this crazy stuff and I suddenly started seeing, oh, someone normal on TV. So it's good to see you.
Ariel, thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
So first of all, before I start getting into the serious stuff, maybe this is also serious. You were just not too long ago at a debate in Canada, which I guess is a very famous debate. I didn't really hear about it until now, but I understand it's something very big, the monk debates. And you were arguing with Douglas Murray, both of you, against Mehdi Hasan. I think he's formerly Al Jazeera. I'm not sure if he's still there. And Gideon Levy from Israel. And if I remember correctly, the question of the debate was, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And you were arguing that it was, you and Douglas, and they were arguing that it doesn't. And you won the debate. They polled the people in the audience after, and more people than before said that they were convinced by your position. And first of all, I want to ask, how was the debate? How do you prepare yourself for such debates? I guess, what is your what do you just come in knowing, because you know all this stuff before? And secondly, my next question, which is uncomfortable for me to ask, but someone like Gideon Levy, who I a little bit know personally, I think I was in a few times on panels with him on TV here. Do you, they bring someone who says, as an Israeli, it's fine to be anti-Israel. It doesn't mean you hate Jews. As an Israeli, you could hate Israel. It's fine. What do you think about this kind of token? They bring someone in that gives them permission, the people who hate us, to actually hate us.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
From my own perspective, in terms of this subject matter, anti-Zionism as a modern subset of anti-Semitism, as the acceptable face of anti-Semitism, I mean, that's a subject I've been grappling with for over 20 years. So in that sense, there wasn't any specific preparation necessary. This is something, unfortunately, that especially through my work with UK Lawyers for Israel is a subject that I have been immersed in, I would say, on a daily basis, and battling through the very real manifestations of anti-Zionism as the modern face of anti-Semitism. What UK Lawyers for Israel does is combat the delegitimization of Israel, attacks on the state, on Israelis, and all of the blood libels, the modern blood libels we're very familiar with, which manifest themselves now increasingly in legal terminology. And that was the raison d'etre of UK Lawyers for Israel when it was established over 10 years ago. So in that respect, we're eating, breathing, sleeping this phenomenon on a daily basis. But in terms of the mechanics of the actual debate, of course, it was important to refresh my memory as to what it is that the members of the opposition were saying most recently, especially in the wake of the 7th of October. And albeit it was not surprising, given I knew them both by reputation, certainly the manifestation or the extent, the extremity of so much of what was said in that debate by the opposition beggars belief. And Levy is unfortunately a key example. I mean, by his own admission, he is on the extreme fringes of Israeli society. I don't think anyone in mainstream Israeli discussion takes him in any way seriously. But the problem is, and I think you put your finger on it, outside of Israel, he is taken to be a representative voice, and he curries a great deal of favor amongst the anti-Zionists, those that hate the Jewish state. And they use him very much as a tool a mascot even for the promotion of their vicious bile and their misrepresentations and lies about the Jewish state. And you can't have a better vehicle for that than an Israeli, someone who says, I served in the IDF and I live in Israel and I am, an Israeli who is supportive of the country, but just not this manifestation of it. The fact that he would be advocating for what is essentially the eradication of Israel. I mean, this idea of a two-state solution or even a one-state solution, which is a euphemism for the destruction of the state of Israel, is deeply, deeply corrosive, but it gives a great deal of credibility to those that are promoting falsehoods against Israel and, as I say, seeking its very destruction.
Yeah. So now that we got that, and also I want to say that you did a great job, and Douglas, I think, was great as usual. We all know Douglas here. He's become this Israeli celebrity. So now I wanted to ask you about your expertise about international law. So we have the case in against Israel, against Israel that South Africa brought. I know now that Egypt is asking to join, and Spain, I think, a few days ago asked to join, and they keep on. I think they, at least by the last time when they made the decision about Rafah, there was like 13 requests by South Africa for Israel for the court to stop to put out injunctions against Israel. And my question is, when I read the first time when the court convened, you see the nationalities of the judges. You see judges from Morocco, from I think Lebanon, which is at war as we speak with Israel, and they have a judge, and I think he's now the chief justice.
Yeah.
So there's a country that's at war with Israel. Hezbollah is part of the government of Lebanon, and the judge that comes from Lebanon is the chief justice that's judging the country that's at war with his country. It seemed to me to be almost, before this case even was discussed, to be like predetermined that Israel would be at least somewhat found to be in the wrong. And then there was a discussion in Israel whether Israel should have taken the case seriously in terms of to legitimize it, to bring in a serious justice like Barak to be part of the bench. I forgot the exact name of how it works. And then they brought in the heads of all the defense team, the top lawyers, and they got a lawyer from Britain, which you probably know better than I do, represented Israel. And my question is, should Israel have legitimized it so much? There were opinions that we should have sent someone very, very low on the food chain, say, okay, we just totally deny everything that's said here, and that's it. That's it. We're not legitimizing even the discussion.
Well, the difficulty is that Israel's stuck between a rock and a hard place, because I would agree with you that this court has essentially done away with any semblance of impartiality, not least because of individuals with a prior track record of vicious anti-Israel bile that are sitting in judgment. I mean, the current president of the court is a case in point, but not just because of the country that he is appointed by, Lebanon. Also, in his case, because of his personal track record as previous ambassador to the United Nations, and allegations that he's levied against Israel of war crimes and apartheid and terrorism even. So that has undoubtedly but dealt a serious blow to the reputation of the court and to any pretense of impartiality. But we also perhaps have to consider the court's track record in this very case. As you say, there have been a number of applications by South Africa for provisional measures. And so this is before the court has even assessed the merits of the case. But 4 applications thus far for provisional measures by South Africa, 3 of which have been, I think, seriously considered by the court and have resulted in orders put out by the court that were promptly misrepresented, or, if we're going to be more charitable, misinterpreted by the entire international community. And for a court, especially in such a sensitive, some may say even explosive case and subject matter, to be consistently putting out orders which its own former president has said have been utterly misrepresented or misinterpreted, is pretty extraordinary, especially when we consider this case as against others and other provisional measures orders that the International Court of Justice has given in cases brought under the Genocide Convention, most notably perhaps against Russia, in which the wording, I mean, it's so instructive to compare the wording of the court's order in 2022 ordering a cessation of Russia's military activity in Ukraine as against the orders that it has issued in the case of South Africa's application, which have not done anything of the sort. The January Provisional Measures Order did not say that there was a plausible case of genocide, despite what you hear from people, and people are still repeating that libel, even though Judge Donoghue came out on Hard Talk on the BBC in an unprecedented fashion to explain what it was that this Provisional Measures Order actually said. The latest order that we had vis-a-vis the Rafah operation, the Rafah operation, again, the court in no way immediately ordered Israel to cease its operations in Rafah. Everything that the court has said has been couched in the terms of the Genocide Convention and under Israel's obligations and responsibilities under the Genocide Convention. And the misrepresentation of the court's approach here, I think, is also an indictment in terms of on how the court has approached this and the arguably politicized motivations that might exist. Now, that leads me on to two other aspects of the question that you posed. One is, what was Israel to do in this respect? Because it's as a result of this case having been brought under the Genocide Convention that the court does have jurisdiction to consider the case that South Africa has brought. As reprehensible and untrue, utterly unfounded as these allegations of genocide are, technically, as a matter of law, the court does have jurisdiction to consider an application by South Africa against another signatory to the Genocide Convention about issues that legally, technically fall under the Genocide Convention. Mm-hmm. And that is why Israel partook of these proceedings, and that is why it instructed a very experienced team of legal counsel, and it put forward its case in accordance with the rules. But of course, the other very important aspect of this is, as you've referenced, the politicization of the court, but the way that this has played out in the international media. These televised court hearings were perhaps the most watched proceedings of the International Court of Justice in its history. And it was clear from the way that South Africa's legal team, I use the term advisedly, presented this libelous case against Israel, that there was very little that they probably hope to achieve at the merit stage of these proceedings. I mean, it's unlikely, even at this politicized court, that the merits of this case will be given anything but short shrift. This is if the law is to be applied properly. But South Africa's real intention with respect to these very initial provisional measures stages was to play to the international gallery, the public gallery, and to advance these libelous allegations. It's not by accident that South Africa has made this allegation of genocide. I mean, firstly, it's to provide that legal hook, as I explained, so that the court has jurisdiction. But the second aspect of this was extremely clear. In the week after the order was provided on the 26th of January, I was on ABC in South Africa, the South African version of BBC, and my counterpart in the context of that interview said, "Isn't it wonderful? Now we can finally use genocide and Israel in the same sentence, and nobody can tell us otherwise." And that was extremely indicative of what the motivation here is, which is to shift the debate and to shift the acceptable discussion about what Israel is doing away from Israel's obligation under the Genocide Convention to pursue those who committed acts of genocide on the 7th of October and to punish and prevent genocide. That is the full title of the Genocide Convention. To shift the discussion away from that and to, in fact, victim blame, or even worse than that, accuse the victims of the very crimes that were committed against them. And in light of the public perception of this and the way that this is playing out in the international media, I think the concerns that you've raised about the way that this case is being treated strictly as legal proceedings is extremely problematic, and it's having a much, much more significant, wider impact in terms of promoting the false allegations rather than the actual legal consequences, which have not been in any way significant.
Natasha, I want to maybe just follow up on something that I find interesting. When the case was being brought the first time, um, the first hearing, we had a lot of people in the media, the Israeli media, saying, this is why our politicians and our people, it wasn't even politicians, was also like former generals, they should all be quiet, because all that was used in, or most of what was used in the, I guess the first petition, maybe other petitions, but definitely the first one, was the case was built around, a lot of it was built around things that people said in response to October 7th. So, for example, they brought the president of Israel, Herzog, who's not a crazy right winger by any stretch. He was the head of the labor, Israel's labor at the time, before he became president. And he said, everybody was very, very shocked after what happened. People said inflammatory things, as you can imagine. And those things were used in order to justify the claim that Israel was planning and doing a genocide. And so I wanted to ask, was there ever another country or another entity that was in any international court prosecuted by things that people, even out of power, were saying in the media? So we're giving, like, for example, a general named Giora Island, former general. He's not in power for years already, and he was advocating for not giving food to the Palestinians, blockading Gaza. None of his suggestions were taken into account. It was never a policy. He was saying that was his opinion, and he was used in the petition of South Africa. So it seemed to me to not make any sense.
Well, the important thing to understand about South Africa's application is that it misrepresented the vast majority of the quotations that it was putting in
That's also
particular,
true.
all of those that came from any individuals with any input into policy. So all the members of the war cabinet. I mean, of course, the president doesn't have an input into policy, but he was also entirely misrepresented and mischaracterized by South Africa and its legal team. And the important qualifier in respect of those quotations is that the individuals were talking about Hamas and not the Palestinian people.
Yes.
And that is entirely legitimate to be talking about the need to eradicate Hamas and prevent them from ever posing a threat as they continue to threaten to commit the 7th of October over and over again. So this idea that Israel has brought this on itself, I think, is deeply misguided, because the situation has been for decades now, in terms of international law and the international legal rhetoric which is applied according to Israel, that it doesn't matter what Israel does.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter what Israelis say. The labels are levied against Israel in any event, and any words that are uttered by those with an input to policy, as we have seen, especially over the last 8 months, are misrepresented. I mean, the allegation of starvation, which has now been again debunked, even by
the UN.
By the UN, by independent international bodies, that is paid to this notion that there is certainly that there is a policy of starvation. I mean, and only looking at the numbers that COGAT put out on their weekly, sometimes daily updates of the volume of aid going through into Gaza would have put those misrepresentations and those falsehoods to bed. But of course, that gets very little airing at the International Court of Justice. It seems only Sebutinde and ad hoc Judge Barak, whom you mentioned, looked at the data that COGAT was providing in any detail. That the other judges have entirely discounted it and have instead based their opinions on NGOs that are operating out of Gaza, who have failed to distribute the aid that Israel has facilitated into the Gaza Strip, and are, by all accounts, very tightly controlled in what they were able to say by Hamas.
Yeah.
And these are the organizations that both the international courts and international media appear to be reliant upon. And none of that is more strongly indicated than by recent reports, including by the Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations, the Pillay inquiry, which was clear from the outset in terms of the track record of the commissioners, the anti-Israel agenda that it had. But even they, in their latest reports, have acknowledged that their criticisms of Israel's conduct come chiefly from unverified witness accounts, undoubtedly coming out of the Gaza Strip and therefore either coached or controlled by Hamas, and also media reports which are a continuation of that Hamas propaganda. So in these contexts, you have to understand what it is, what the information that these international tribunals and the international media are relying upon. And it's not for lack of the truth, the real facts being out there. It's the fact that they are deliberately putting those aside and embracing the continuation of Hamas propaganda as an alternative.
Yeah, I just want to say before we go off the court, the ICJ, that the judge from Uganda that you just mentioned, I can't pronounce her name.
Yes,
she is amazing. I was reading her opinion, the first one. It's so clear and just it's a shame that there aren't more judges like her in general. But obviously, on such a court that has so much consequences to what its decisions are. Now, I want to ask you about. You were talking about how everything.
Just to add to that very
Yeah.
briefly, I agree, and I would certainly advocate her dissenting opinions in respect to the applications plural that South Africa has brought. But what she says, and in her attempt to hold the International Court of Justice to its own rules and procedures, is critical, because this isn't just about Israel.
Yeah.
The approach that the ICJ is adopting now in relation to the case that South Africa has brought has desperate consequences for international law more generally, and also for the court's reputation going forward. And because it is throwing out of the window its own rules, the proper application of international law, I think we're going to see enormous damage done to the court going forward, and its ability to rule with any legitimacy or credibility on issues outside of Israel in the future is inevitably going to be tainted by what we're seeing now. And she's calling that out, and that's extremely important.
Yeah, and also one last question that I just think that we should ask. There were calls here, and I think that we should do this. Is that Israel should do the same type of lawfare that South Africa is doing now? So Israel should start suing countries that are against it, that are part of the court, that are under the court's jurisdiction. That's just my. If South Africa could bring a totally libelous suit like this, just to fight, to harm, to weaken Israel, then Israel should start doing. Israel's allies, Israel itself, should start petitioning the court against its enemies, or it's the countries that are being example. We have now countries that are recognizing a so-called Palestinian state that has no border, no leaders, no government, no nothing, and just to punish Israel. So Israel should just use the courts to do the same thing, because once one side could do it, the other side could do it too.
So a couple of things on that. The reason that these lawfare activities, and I say lawfare, this is an abuse of international law. This is not a proper application of the law by any stretch of the imagination. But the reason that these lawfare activities are effective against Israel is because it is a law-abiding state. And it takes the rule of law and international law extremely seriously. In 2016, I was working at the Israeli Supreme Court under Miriam Naor, and it was plain to me, just from my experiences there as a foreign clerk, the importance that the Israeli legal system places on international law in terms of how it adopts international courts' decisions and reasoning, and its application of aspects of international law into the domestic jurisdiction. So they are effective against Israel for that reason. But if you are thinking about Iran, for instance, which, interestingly enough, rejoined the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice a little over a year ago. And that's indicative of something extremely important in and of itself. I mean, Iran wouldn't be joining the jurisdiction of a court that it thought it wouldn't be able to manipulate,
Right.
because it is the foremost state sponsor of terrorism. Russia has not complied with the court's provisional measures order because it is not a state that prizes international law or that sees any difficulty with violating it. So the ability to actually use these legal institutions legitimately to further the proper application of international law by Israel is ultimately going to be frustrated by the absence of there being any proper enforcement mechanism with respect to states who simply don't care about judgments against them. It will only ultimately be sanctions against Iran, for instance, that we may be experiencing a different approach by the United States after the November elections. But thus far, of course, international law breaking by the likes of Russia and Iran has not exactly been met by stringent opposition. And the only real enforcement mechanisms vis-a-vis that law breaking are international sanctions.
Yeah. But I guess you didn't. Do you think that Israel should at least just try to bring cases against countries that are harassing them, to put it, I guess that's the word I'll use, in the courts?
I think that there's not a great deal to be gained from that as a result of everything that I've explained, and there are extremely pressing matters. I entirely understand the frustration that it seems to be playing defense rather than offense.
Right.
And I think that the critical message that needs to be gotten across is that these abuses of international legal institutions and mechanisms are spelling extremely bad news for all law-abiding states.
Yeah.
And that is not just to do with Israel. The UK, the US, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, all ought to have serious concerns about these abuses and ought to be standing against them. And we haven't talked about the International Criminal Court
Yeah,
yet.
that's my next question.
Of course.
So my next question is, which you alluded to, is we have the prosecutor at the ICC, the Criminal Court, International Criminal Court, which is a very weird court, I have to say. Just reading about it in the past week, it's very, very, I think just the whole way it's set up is very weird. And the fact that the US, I think, is not part of it says something. And so, and a number of other countries that are big violators, some of them, but they're not part of it for a reason. Do you is it plausible that Prime Minister Netanyahu or Gallant or Herzia Levy, the head of the IDF, will be arrested if they go to certain countries in Europe in the next year or so?
So the arrest warrants have yet to be issued.
Yeah.
They have been applied for, as you say, by the current prosecutor, Karim Khan. This is all on the basis of a provisional decision on jurisdiction that the pre-trial chamber reached in 2021. Actually, it's one that the organization UK Lawyers for Israel and others made substantive representations in relation to as friends of the court, amici curiae. And the pre-trial chamber was split on the question of jurisdiction. Judge Kovacs gave a very powerful dissenting judgment. And the reason that that's extremely important in the context of the previous prosecutor's application to open this investigation, that was Fatou Bensouda, that the reason that is critical is because the question of jurisdiction is about to be grappled with all over again. So in 2021, the court said, well, we're finding as a provisional matter that the court has jurisdiction to open an investigation, but in the event that there are any arrest warrants applied for, the question of jurisdiction will have to be properly addressed. Now, the UK has already made an application for permission to put in submissions on the question of jurisdiction. There will be other submissions coming, certainly from NGOs, and we're working on an update. But the big questions here are how on earth the current prosecutor can apply for arrest warrants in a case where the ICC simply does not have jurisdiction. Now, the main reason for this is, of course, Israel is not a party to the court. It is not a member state of the Rome Statute that established the court. And you mentioned, of course, neither is that matter the United States. There are very clear reasons, I believe, that neither of those states ultimately joined a court, that they were both quite influential in the initial thinking, in the process that began the motivation for the initiative for an international criminal court. But it was pretty clear when it came to the drafting of the Rome Statute that this was going to be used as a political tool against Israel. One example of that is in the definition of crimes under Article 8. Many people accuse Israel of war crimes, of the crime of the transfer, the illegal transfer of settlers. There are many, many reasons why that is an illiterate interpretation of international law, which we might have to leave for a separate podcast. But critically, the provision that is relied upon comes out of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49.6, which addresses the transfer of populations into occupied territory. Now, it's very, very interesting that when the Rome Statute was being drafted, that wording from the Fourth Geneva Convention was taken and it was changed. And the words directly or indirectly were inserted into the article that encompassed this crime under the Rome Statute. And that was taken, I think, as a strong indication both by Israel and the United States that there were forces up to no good behind the drafting of the Rome Statute. And so Israel and the United States never joined the court. In the absence of a state providing the court with jurisdiction over its territory, the court has no business launching an investigation or seeking arrest warrants. Now, what the court has predicated its investigation and the application for warrants on is this notion that the so-called state of Palestine has acceded to the court. Now, again, there is a long shopping list of problems with that analysis, not least because Palestine is not a state, because it does not have jurisdiction over territory to sign over to the court. I mean, even the Oslo Accords tell us this. And in fact, every move that the Palestinian Authority has taken in international legal institutions to promote statehood outside of the framework provided by the Oslo Accords, which was endorsed by the international community. I mean, that is a breach of an international agreement in and of itself. So the court does not have jurisdiction over either the Palestinians or of the Israelis in this case. But even putting that aside, what the application for arrest warrants completely rides roughshod over is the fundamental principle at the International Court of Justice, which is complementarity. And complementarity means that the court will not take action where a state's authorities are willing and able to uphold the relevant law themselves. Now, in Israel's case, not only have there been already disciplinary investigations and even criminal investigations, even from the beginning of this process of the last 8 months, the suggestion that the Israeli legal system is not willing or able to hold individuals to account for credible unlawful activity is utterly ludicrous. And it's clear that the prosecutor has given absolutely no thought to the implementation of this principle of complementarity, not least because this application for arrest warrants has been made in the context of a continuing war before any actions can feasibly be taken. So on so many levels here, the activity that we are witnessing at the International Criminal Court is outrageous. And again, it presents a significant threat to the legitimacy of the court and to its ability to credibly uphold international law going forward. Another reason that I think it's extremely important, if the UK is indeed submitting on jurisdiction and other law-abiding states are likewise minded, to put the court back onto the straight and narrow, because after well over a decade of an appalling track record of a court that has had its reputation absolutely trashed, it seems clear to me that the current prosecutor is simply seeking to rehabilitate the court in the eyes of the world by seizing on the world's current punching bag, the Jewish state, and seeking to rehabilitate its own reputation by these arrest warrants in an unprecedented fashion that it's seeking against democratically elected and accountable leaders, in the case of Netanyahu and Gallant.
But do you think that, I agree with everything you said, do you think that the warrants will be approved and that it will be dangerous for them to actually leave Israel?
Well, if the warrants are approved, then my expectation is that a number of member states will seek to abide by them. And of course, we had an election last week in the United Kingdom, and the new foreign minister, David Lammy, has indicated that if arrest warrants are issued, the United Kingdom will respect them. So there is a new regime here in the United Kingdom, and it will inevitably mean, of course, that if they are issued, that Gallant and Netanyahu will have to be careful where they travel to. But it would be my expectation, if the court is going down this route, that they will not be the only ones. And of course, it's significant that the court does not have to be public about the arrest warrants that it seeks. So the big question will be for all of those Israelis that may be subject to future applications which are dealt with in secret and that won't even know that they may face arrest if they are traveling internationally as a result of the court ultimately acting entirely out with its jurisdiction and the very statute that founded it.
Yeah. I want to ask you a very weird question that I was thinking about before talking to you. We hear a lot about the occupied territories, and I remember talking to Professor Neil Ferguson about the claim that Israel is settler colonialism, and we hear that a lot all over, the occupation, this and that. We all know the narrative, and I guess my question is, how back does international law go? So, I mean, if you're talking to a regular Israeli, a Zionist who lives in Israel, he'll say, we're here because in the land of Israel, because the Bible, we've been praying to Israel their whole 2,000 years. We stood, my ancestors in Poland, before they were killed, murdered in the Holocaust, prayed 3 times a day towards Zion and Jerusalem. And then when you talk to maybe a Palestinian or someone in the West who's talking about settler colonialism, he'll say, who cares what the book said? There's been Palestinians here for 300 years. I don't know. I'm just throwing out. It's not true, but let's just say. And so the question is, how does international law, in terms, not politicized, I know it's hard, how back does it look in terms of these things? So
there is a very clear answer to this. And I know many people reference back to, the Balfour Declaration, which did have an element of binding international sort of legal significance to it, because it was the statement of a foreign minister. People also refer to the mandate and the formation of that for the purpose of establishing a Jewish national home, and the League of Nations sort of legal status in that coming to be. Also, of course, the San Remo conference. But I think that there is a far clearer starting point in international law, and it requires simply the application of the universal rule of uti possidetis juris. Uti possidetis juris is the default rule that determines a state's borders at their moment of independence. This is a rule of customary international law. It is one that developed over time. It was applied in the 19th century with the withdrawal of the Spanish from South America. And the idea behind it was to prevent what was called a terra nullius, a vacuum, an area that simply didn't have a sovereign over it. But after that, it was applied in Asia, in Africa. It also applied to the dissolution of the former communist federations. Essentially, in every case of a new state coming into being, this is the rule that dictated what that state's borders were, where there was no other agreement to the contrary. Now, in Israel's case, after the severance of Transjordan, we have the British Mandate of Palestine, where the administrative line, which previously separated that as part of the mandate from Transjordan, that administrative line of the British Mandate ran all the way down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea.
Yeah.
And it incorporated, of course, what later became known as the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The application of this universal rule of customary international law, or typos iuris juris, simply states that at the declaration of Israel's independence on the 14th of May, 1948, when it came into being after the withdrawal of the British from the mandate, Israel automatically inherits the pre-existing administrative lines of the unit that preceded it. And it doesn't matter that that Israel, lost control, if you will, of that territory almost immediately because, it was subject in terms of the West Bank to Jordanian occupation, and in terms of Gaza, it was subject to Egyptian occupation. It doesn't matter that there was no international agreement. It doesn't even matter whether or not Israel was claiming this territory at the time or not. This is a matter of fundamental customary international law that operates as a default. And the International Court of Justice in the Burkina Faso Mali case talked about the emergence of this rule and the reasons for it to prevent fratricidal struggles, to provide clean lines on borders, stability, and certainty. All of the things, of course, which were desperately needed in the context of Israel's emergence. When Israel recovers that territory that was occupied, as I mentioned, respectively by Egypt and by the Jordanians in 1967, this puts an end to their occupation. And ultimately, Israel is recovering its original sovereign territory. Now, Israel doesn't apply its law, administration, and jurisdiction in full to the entirety of Judea and Samaria. It only does that with respect to Jerusalem. And the reason for that, which is clear if you look at what was being discussed at the time, is that Israel anticipated under that land for peace formula that it would give Jordan part of that territory in pursuit of a peace agreement with the Jordanians. Now, when 1994 came along and that peace agreement ultimately happened, the Jordanians didn't want anything to do with that territory. And in the interim, from 1967 onwards, Israel had established this temporary administrative framework. The reason occupation as a legal term is totally inapplicable to what we are witnessing, there are multifaceted reasons for that, but one of them is that one cannot occupy one's own sovereign territory. Another is that there is no prior sovereign other than Israel that this territory is seemingly occupied from.
Right.
And ultimately, what Israel did was apply aspects of the framework of the laws of occupation in its temporary administrative framework for this territory, which has subsequently, of course, in many respects, even been overtaken by the Oslo Accords and the formation of areas A, B, and C. And so, reasons number 5, 6, and 7 that the term occupation is utterly inapplicable here is that the Palestinians have an autonomy there in areas A and B. Again, something that is not discussed. And taking us just back to the beginning of your question, where you talked about your previous podcast with Neil Ferguson and this blood libel of settler colonialism. What we're seeing is that this politicized term, occupation, which has no legal basis, is being deployed to present a false historical narrative, which is that there was a state of Palestine before the formation of Israel. Now, I should know, perhaps, because my grandparents were Palestinian. They were living in the British Mandate, and they had identity cards issued to them by the British that said race Jewish, nationality Palestinian. So the idea of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity came much, much later on.
Yeah.
It was formed by Yasser
1964, I think, even before the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Occupation in quotes.
Absolutely. Well, I'd advise against the use of incorrect terminology here.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Before Israel recovered that territory in 1967 from Jordan, the PLO had already been established with the simple motivation of pushing the Jews into the sea.
Yes.
I mean, this has been the mantra from the get-go, and the invention of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity, as you say, in the 1960s, had with it this misinformation agenda, which has
Mhm.
played into the way that legal terminology is being misrepresented and misapplied. And so the two are very closely related, which is
Yeah.
why lawfare has become such a powerful tool amongst those with an anti-Israel agenda.
Yeah. And I would just say that I did it in Hebrew, so maybe not our listeners here could, but if you know Hebrew, I did an excellent, if I may say so, talk with Einat Wilf, who studies she's an expert in UNRWA, which is a separate issue, but we spoke a lot about the Palestinian National Movement and what its first, when it came about, when it was invented, so to speak, what were its ideals? And the only ideals were destroying Israel. At least in the beginning, we could say, a lot of the formation slowly, a national identity forms, but at least in the beginning, there is really no doubt because the founding documents are there. We could read them. They're here. That was their raison. You say better, raison d'être. That was their national. The reason for their formation was to basically be a fighting front towards the Zionist entity, so to speak. So I think
And
it's
Chi
it's
and Adi
yeah,
Schwartz do a phenomenal job in their book, The War of Return, in documenting that. And I hope that it will be widely read and recognized. When you say that was the initial founding purpose, that's absolutely right. But I
yeah,
think we suggest that things have changed at our peril,
yes,
because everything we have seen, especially since the 7th of October, in the way that the curriculum under the Palestinian Authority that taught in UNRWA schools still educates to the eradication of Israel
hmm,
and the notion that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr and kill as many Jews as possible. I mean, the impact of that on the 7th of October alone is palpable when we consider that 3/4 of the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October were educated in the UNRWA school system. We can see the impact that indoctrination has had, and the messaging that you say UNRWA was initially established with is still very much alive and well,
yeah.
and being taught from kindergarten level up.
Natasha, two more things before we finish. The first one is I mentioned in the beginning, you are a lot on media all over the Western English speaking world, especially in Great Britain where you live. And when I saw some of your interviews just getting ready to speak to you, and it's a lot of the questions seem to be so biased and not even looking for an answer. It's almost like you're being brought into the studio to fight. They're not bringing you in to speak to you. They're bringing you in to like admonish you for being. How could you support Israel? How could this be when they're doing A, B, and C, which they're not doing? And how do you see the Western media? Because, like you said, there's one um, party is in Democratic. You may. I have a lot of stuff that I think that the government here is very bad, doesn't do good. It's fine, but that's why we have an election. We have protests in the streets. It's everything. No one's killing people for protesting against the government. There's free. Again, we could have different, criticisms of the local government, but the fact that we're allowed to criticize it is one of the reasons why the difference between us and, for example, Hamas or the Palestinian Authority and gay rights is one of the other things that I find unbelievable. The whole Queers for Palestine, the progressive movement who hates Israel for some reason and goes to all these protests. And then you're brought in and they're like, you're being admonished for
Mm.
defending and supporting the people who support human rights, the people who defend the living, the people who defend, just fairness. And it's how do you explain it?
So, first of all, I see my role in this context as ultimately standing up for the truth and the rule of law. And my day job is as a barrister. So my professional obligations as a member of the bar in the United Kingdom are as an officer of the court, to stand up for the proper application of the rule of law. And that has been my primary motivating factor. I have to say, I do not see myself as an advocate for Israel, even if, as you say, increasingly, when I'm interviewed, that is how I am viewed and admonished, and increasingly, people refer to, but your allies are telling you X, Y, and Z, which is ultimately, it doesn't bother me to the extent that it doesn't change the reasons that I'm speaking out on this. And I cannot stress enough that the consequences of what we are seeing are not just going to be felt by Israel, but they really do threaten the international legal order more broadly. It is so important, though, that while I am trying to address the misrepresentations of international law, that there is also an opportunity to push back on the factual misrepresentations, because the international media plainly, to my mind, has an agenda, and the way in which they handle interviews with me is part and parcel of that. I hope that we will get to the point ultimately where they will move away from the argument or the debate and actually be prepared to listen to the facts and the law. And I have to say that I will not tire from seeking that engagement. I consider it to be an enormous privilege that I'm able to do so, but also I do feel an overwhelming sense of duty, both because of my profession and because I happen to be in possession of the facts and an understanding of the proper application of the law here. And I see that as a mission that I certainly will not tire from, simply because of the way that you describe the reception at this point. I do find myself on occasion getting through, and
Once in a while.
once in a while, but that's enough to keep me going, because I think to the extent that it also encourages others who understand the situation to be more ready to speak up and to challenge this received wisdom that we are encountering, which inverts reality, and really it's a fouch. To suggest that Israel is the breaker of international law here. It is entirely the opposite, and that's an incredibly important message to keep delivering.
And I'll also just say before we last thing on a more personal note, but that I called my podcast The Western Spirit because the West as an ideal is very important, I think, for anyone who loves freedom and loves human rights and thinks it's important to let people be themselves, so to speak, and break barriers and make something of themselves. And when we look at what is being said in the West about the conflict here and about just what's happening, we see, I think it's very obvious to someone who's looking, maybe from the outside I'm looking, so that's why, is that there's one side that's pro-West. So you'll see on an Israeli pro-Israel rally in the US, in Washington, D.C., you'll have American flags at the rally. In Great Britain, I assume, I'm not a Brit, but I assume in rallies that are pro-Israel, you'll have the British flag. On the other hand, when I'm looking at the Washington, D.C. protests, or in New York, where my father lives, pro-Palestinian protests, they don't have any American flags. The flags that are being flown are Hamas flags a lot of times. Hezbollah, there's now stuff, the Houthis, I don't even understand how that's even possible that someone likes these barbaric thugs. But the fact is that there's one side that's pro-West, pro-freedom, and whoever supports it usually is pro-freedom and pro-West. And the other side is pro-theocracy, I'm sorry, but pro what happened on October 7th. We see that. And so if you're a normal person, someone who likes the Western way of life, the side you should be on is so obvious to me that it's very sad that some people are even contemplating which side they should be on. But I have last question to you is, you live in Great Britain, and we have friends who are there who live in London, and they told me that they're scared to walk out of their house with a kippah. And on Shabbat, where you had all these protests on Saturday, they were they told their wives and the children not to leave their homes. And I think there was a story that London became the most dangerous city for Jews in Europe, or something to that effect. How do you see your country? Where are we going in terms of the treatment of Jews and just being safe?
Hmm. Well, I'm speaking now a great deal more in the Jewish community, and what you are describing is palpable. I mean, there are weekly hate marches,
Yeah.
pro-Hamas marches that have taken over central London, and many in the community are feeling extremely intimidated, attacked even by this phenomenon. And of course, those fears have only been heightened with the new government as of the end of last week. Where we have heard consistent rhetoric, which causes additional levels of concern, I'm
Yeah.
sure. I can only hope that that time-honored phrase, "What you see from here, you don't see from there." I can only hope that that applies to this new government, in that all of the rhetoric that they have engaged in, the anti-Zionist, propaganda, which is inevitably in and of itself anti-Semitic, that may take a back seat where the new ministers are put in possession of important information, not least, of course, this elusive legal advice that has been much talked of vis-a-vis Israel's application of international humanitarian law in Gaza. I'd hope that if those who have been calling for this advice to be made public for many, many months now in the Labour Party, if they actually have access to it as members of the new government, they may readjust their approach and recognise the error of their ways and their criticism that they have made from the sidelines, as I say, from there as opposed to from here. But all of the indicators are unfortunately not positive. And quite apart from the success that the Labour Party had in the election and their policy of recognising a state of Palestine, of upholding arrest warrants issued by the ICC against Israelis, even discussions now of seeking to impose an arms embargo on Israel, all of that is part of the story. Another part of the story is 5 independents who were elected
Yes.
purely on
Gaza.
an anti-Israel platform, and their single election issue was Gaza. And we are seeing that phenomenon replicated certainly in other parts of Europe. It's interesting to me that you reference the UK as being in Europe. We had
You left.
we had
Sorry.
quite
Yeah.
quite a traumatic exit by all accounts, but albeit that we are seeing a significant degree of pushback in other European capitals and in the context of other elections. This is a big election year, both obviously in the UK just now, in the US coming up, but in the European Union, France. And it's clear that in respect to the Netherlands also, there has been a significant political shift in relation to many of the issues that you have been raising.
Yeah.
We have yet to see that in the United Kingdom. But I think whether or not that necessarily materializes depends on how this new government conducts itself,
Yeah.
and whether it will stick to the extremely misguided and harmful rhetoric that has characterized its time in opposition and even its campaign in the last elections, or whether now that they are in a position of responsibility, they will actually realize that there is an importance of acting like grown-ups when you are running a country that has significant international clout, recognizing the importance for the United Kingdom that international law is not ridden roughshod over, and the importance of pushing back on these blood libels, because what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. And I think we are now facing a tumultuous time, to be sure, but a very, very significant turning point. And how the next months and years pan out will have a fundamental significance for the future of the very values that you have outlined are at the center of this podcast. Those that love freedom and liberal democratic values that are embodied in the only democracy in the Middle East need to ensure that they stand by that only democracy in the Middle East. And what we have seen in terms of encampments on university campuses, even at the faculty level of so many of these universities, is a manifestation of a loss of faith in those fundamental principles of freedom and democratic values. And we have seen a generation of individuals grow up almost to be ashamed of those Western values and to embrace in that vacuum, with that lack of sense of purpose, to embrace instead support of internationally prescribed terror organizations. So there needs to be a wholesale shift from the very educational institutions to the political institutions and the media institutions, if we are to have a hope of rallying against these forces of Islamist extremism and those forces that seek to take our Western freedoms away from us. And in that respect, this is as much the UK's, the US's, Europe's fight as it is Israel's.
Natasha Hausdorff, it was a pleasure talking to you. I have to say that the issues that we spoke about today are about the lawfare. I don't really know. To be frank, it's not my forte. But I think that at the end of the day, what you did explain to me is that it's not really international law that's being done here. It's actual war done through means of law. And I think that's important for people to understand, and maybe to also, through our podcast, understand what to say to people when they bring up, the international law said this, court of law said this and that and that. We explained through you what the answers should be. So I think it was important. And obviously the last part is something that we hear a lot, and we should be speaking about it all the time. And I know that you maybe feel sometimes that you speak too much about some of these things, but they are important for people like me to hear. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Ariel, thank you. Toda.
And thank you to all our listeners and viewers. And we'll see you. Subscribe. It's important for me to say, subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you in the next episode.